We'll move on to the second paper and the last paper in this opening session. This is a paper presented by Anna Schliehe and Ben Crewe from Cambridge University. I think Anna is going to be speaking, am I right? I'm not sure if Ben is as well, but if he is, then I'm sure that you'll do a good double act here. It's Top-bunk, bottom-bunk, the geographies of cell sharing. So off you go, please, Anna.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and good morning. And thanks for the introduction, Dom. I'll get started right away. So my name is Anna Schliehe, and I will be presenting the talk today on behalf of the co-author Ben Crewe and the whole Compen team. And Ben might be joining us later for the questions. So in the next 20 minutes, I will be talking about giving you a brief background on the Compen project, as well as on the sociology of cell sharing and where the action is in prisons, before going into kind of more detail on the empirical material, where we'll be talking about objection and kindness, as well as solo and joint strategies and their mobility. So in our research on prisoners' experiences in England and Wales and Norway, cell sharing was not part of the research focus per se, but over the course of 2 years of fieldwork, we were struck by how stories about this aspect kind of meander through many interviews, informal encounters, and ethnographic observations. Of course, cell sharing is a major part of prison life, and we've heard some of this already in Eleanor's talk. And it's like that in many countries, and it's therefore surprising that not much has been written about the wider implications of everyday life in a shared cell. So in this paper, we want to explore these ideas with the help of interview data that is part of the Compen project. And all of the data today is taken from the entry, exit, and post-release sub-study with over 400 interviews, in which we will focus on our UK data. So our analysis of the individual experiences of cell sharing see the cell as a crucial place of where the action is in prisons, adding to the spaces that McDermott and King famously described. So highlighting the cell is the crucial area of interaction and emotional and relational management that does not take away from the importance of landings and communal areas, but rather direct our focus to the micro level of interaction and action in prisons. So while McDermott and King rightly point to the game of diplomacy between staff and prisoners, we argue here that it is exactly this diplomacy on a horizontal level between prisoners who share a cell that affects their lives most intimately. Being with other prisoners in what Goffman calls an enforced collective, and what Sykes named as one of the foremost pains of imprisonment, is nowhere as pronounced as in the cell. Linked to sheer survival, it is as much a matter of the mind as a matter of the body to kind of navigate sharing a cell. And we argue that it is as delicate a situation as it is ritualized, often managed with a good portion of humor on part of the ones sharing, but nonetheless equally often characterized by tenseness, fear, and social struggle. Cell sharing is part of everyday life in British prisons, even though many cells are not actually designed to be shared. Cells are where prisoners spend most of their time. Sleeping, eating, defecating, they're spaces of intimacy and mobility, which is both restricted mobility and negotiated mobility. So with recent publications on the prison cell, notably by Turner and Knight in 2020, it's interesting to observe that the cell is largely seen as an ambiguous place, but substantially as one that is a manifestation of solitariness. While there is a small amount of research on the impact of cell sharing on personal well-being and prison quality, much less has been written about the lived experience, daily dynamics, and significance of negotiating shared space under conditions of coercion. So in order to capture conceptually what we hear from interviewees about the experiences of cell sharing, we want to engage with a Goffmanesque understanding of how space becomes compressed when faced with loss of privacy, deprivation of dignity, and personal boundaries. And these themes, while having been discussed in prison research for a long time, have not really been directly linked to the sociology of cell sharing as such. So life under imminent exposure affects prisoners' everyday life and their sense of self, and is described by Goffman as an experience of loss and mortification. This experience of the mortification of self is exacerbated by suffering physical and verbal indignities, as well as having to ask permission for things formerly well within one's own control, like where to sleep or which program to watch on TV, and so on. Other kinds of mortification include contaminative exposure, when one's own territory is violated and the boundary of the self is profaned. So notions of objection, which are very much part of Sibley, Kristeva and Douglas's work, and of course of disgust, are strongly linked to prisoners' struggles when it comes to cell sharing. As usual, coping mechanisms of dealing with dirt, excrement and exposure of unwanted substances are disrupted and cause visceral and often painful mortification. However, the process of cell sharing and the process of mortification within the cell is just one side of the story. So most prisoners adapt to and develop their own way to deal with this, and they build their identity around the institutional lifestyle if they're there long enough. And the shared cell is a space of human adaptation and skilled relation work, which we will see shortly. The politics involved in doing double bang up, which I guess is part of the prison lingo, as many call it, reach right into the most personal parts of prisoners' lives and are highly determinate of the experiences of imprisonment overall. So we want to now focus on the lived experiences of cell sharing, and one particularly difficult aspect of it is related to time, as many prisoners in England and Wales are locked up for most of the day, sometimes 23 hours or more. Michael, for example, describes how that is the particular aspect that makes sharing so hard, because when you spend 23 hours a day in a small room, you can see, like in the quotes on the screen, how people might find that difficult, and how it is a very important task to find the right cellmate to do this with. So, for example, one says it's like a jigsaw puzzle that just fits if it does. So, while some people are more proactive in their strategies than others, many interviewees underline how hard it is to essentially not have a say in who enters your cell, if you like. So Lexi, for example, is describing the anxiety of having to share with a stranger who could be anybody, anyone from a heroin addict to a crack addict to an alcoholic. Not knowing your cellmate means living your everyday life in a state of constant alertness and feeling wary of that. As Levy says, we've got to face each other and do our sentence, or as you call it, do your bird, but I don't know what that bird is. So on top of that, a very basic need for privacy is not possible in a shared cell. As Jacob describes, you cannot go to the toilet for several days because it's just too awkward. And it can be all the little things that make or break the cell sharing relationship. We will now turn to issues of objection and the kind of non-negotiable matter that somehow has to be negotiated in a very small locked space of the cell. Notions of objection and disgust are strongly linked to prisoners' struggles with mortification and disruption of spatial and personal integrity. And the most prevalent struggle among our interviewees is connected to the fact that in most prisons, the toilet is installed in the cell, which means there's no getting away from the sounds, smells and sight of shit, which Eva describes as absolutely freaking horrendous. It's seen by many as the most degrading part of prison, and it's a strong demarcator of difference between us and them, or I and him or her in the cell. And as Luca and Chloe describe here, there are other body practices, like, for example, washing your feet in a sink away, just a little bit away from your head, or spitting and burping, all connected to essentially the mobility of another person, including mobility of smells, of sounds, of sights, and body movement and body positions, like squatting, for example, that causes objection and disgust. However, not all stories are connected to just disgust, but also to fear, and the anticipation of having to share a cell inherently invokes feelings of anxiety, which is mentioned by most of our interviewees. This can be an all-encompassing feeling like Lewis describes. It's all he's been thinking about. But the fear of sharing with someone essentially unknown and potentially violent, a kind of abstract and the dangerous situation that you might be exposed to, is different to the feelings that occur in tangible and actual encounters. So the descriptions of fear and anxiety connected to sharing a small space ranged from low-level but persistent feelings of insecurity, like Nathan describes here, who says he cannot stand up to his cellmate who's just much bigger and he just takes what he wants, to the kind of more intense anxiety, which is caused by extreme cases of mobility. For example, in Jacob's case, his cellmate who's writing with his blood on the wall. And of course, fear of violent mobility, which is also mentioned by quite a few of our interviewees. However, not all stories are connected to fear, and instead cell sharing is often connected to acts of kindness, the reduction of anxiety, and even the development of friendship. So many of our interviewees describe small and big acts of kindness, and they have experienced those in the context of cell sharing or have bestowed them on their cellmates. So one of the existential acts of kindness towards first-timers is being shown the ropes, involving getting them used to particular prison mobilities of what happens when, what happens where, and adjusting the cell, so the micro-mobility within the small space, moving things around. So Tariq, for example, points out that your cellmate is like your wife. He hasn't got one, but he still thinks that everything about you is known to your cellmate, including intimate bodily movements of defecation, changing, and bodily habits. So they adapt and to resist and deal with cell sharing, which we have divided into solo strategies and joint strategies. And this means that joint strategies means that two people are sharing joint forces to make life in close confinement just a little bit easier on themselves. While most strategies are born out of the moment, there are certain unofficial rules that kind of govern the politics of the cell. The most notable is what we termed top-bunk, bottom-bunk. So across many different prisons, different sexes, different security categories and cultures, we found surprisingly unison explanation of what bunk is preferable and who has the right to choose. Marif explains that it is the bottom bunk that is the status symbol, and having to sleep in the top bunk is decided by the person who's there before you. So agency and mobility in the cell are therefore at least partly predetermined, and other strategies, both solo and joint strategies, fit into this framework or code that many prisoners seem to adhere to implicitly. As you can see here, there's a whole set of solo strategies that prisoners deploy when being faced with cell sharing dilemmas, and that range from compliance to comedy, trying to relax and pacify someone, to claiming being racist or homophobic, or talking violence, or kicking off an actual aggression. So these are generally used by people who are struggling with a particular aspect of cell sharing or with the general idea of it. So solo strategies range from claiming space and pushing back against the cellmate who is crossing boundaries, like Sophia, for example, who is doing both, kind of. She's describing the emotional toll it takes and the stress that is caused by it. So just to kind of paraphrase, her cellmate has left the cell and she says, "This is my chance to get changed, so I lock the door." And she keeps trying to open it. She opens the flap, she can see me, I'm trying to get changed, but she still insists on standing there. Others like Louis or Ayo actively use strategies of pacification. So relaxing their cellmate is a means of surviving and deflecting tension in situations that might otherwise result in violence or altercation. Though it is often very striking how solo strategies in particular often reflect a silent struggle. So many prisoners explain how there's very little exchange and how they feel intensely lonely in the company of their cellmate. So Andre or Poppy say they prefer tense silence over actually talking to their cellmate. But more active strategies of dealing with difficult cellmates can take quite radical form. Like Nathan, who deliberately acts what he calls insane, just in order to scare a bullying cellmate. He says, "So I'm talking to myself in the mirror, He said, "Who are you talking to?" And I say, "My friend." He looks around at the cell and obviously he can't see anyone. That look in his face, I'll never forget that until I die. I will never forget that look on that guy's face. He looked so fucking scared, it was unbelievable. But the most radical solo strategy maybe is of course violence, which is also described by quite a few of our interviewees. And solo strategies inherently show many aspects of mobility. Cell sharing in general means frequently moving cells, changing cellmates. For example, Isabel says in 23 weeks she had 16 cellmates. Moving around. Yep, thank you. Moving yourself as a solo strategy, like moving makes time go faster, as Joshua says, and getting moved due to the clashing personalities. But because doubles are small and cellmates have to learn how to walk around each other, and sometimes, as Kai says, to get a move, that's what you have to do. Sometimes you have to kick off, you have to kick up a fuss to get what you want. And what we will see next also includes the intricate joint strategies of personal movement in the cell and object mobility, like folding boxer shorts and socks a certain way, stacking them up a certain way, or arranging shower gel very neatly, involving everyday awareness and willingness to move items in a certain way to accommodate your cellmate. So when involuntarily sharing a small space with a stranger or even someone you know, developing joint strategies requires a lot of emotion management. And a give and take and a kind of mutual understanding. And joint strategies are born out of commonality and a desire to make a difficult situation work. And they're essentially an aim that many prisoners strive towards, as we could see in the beginning of the talk, where people are really actively trying to find a good cellmate. So the list of joint strategies range from those practical solutions to more emotionally involved strategies that include giving something up for the other person. So you can see kind of shared cleaning on one side of the scale, whereas a kind of actively granting control to someone is on the other side. But, as a shared responsibility for cleaning the cell, for example, this might sound like a very mundane everyday act. But in actual fact, it shows a special understanding of the cellmate's needs, the cell's mobile geography as well. Granting your cellmate a certain degree of privacy takes effort and thought and often involves detailed knowledge of what happens when in the cell, the kind of timetable, as well as the kind of will to be cautious. And the most common joint strategy in this regard is to create a little curtain, a privacy curtain around the toilet so that each cellmate can go to the toilet unseen. More complex joint strategies are bridging divides between very different people, as Luca describes, for example, who finds out that despite differences, having in-depth conversation means that he can see this other person as a nice bloke, even though he thinks they're very, very different people. And as you can see, joint strategies are all about micromobilities. Like Willow's description of intricate movements choreographed almost to grant privacy to each other in a non-verbal way, almost like a dance where one person moves one way, the other moves the other way, and they're really aware what each other are doing. And even dealing with things like aggression and agitation in a collaborative way takes a joint approach to inner cell mobility, as Jacob explains here. You might get agitated, you might want to punch someone because the TV is so boring. And you just pace up and down your cell, it's horrible. And you can't even, the two of you can't even do that at the same time because it just doesn't fit. You have to kind of take turns in pacing.
2 minutes remaining.
Yes, thank you. So making everyday life work in a confined space of a small cell does initially suggest notions of inertia, standstill and compression. However, as we could see, cell sharing involves a major storyline of mobility. We could see here that there are manifold ways in which geographies of the cell matter both intimately and socially. And for many prisoners, the cell is where the action is in prisons. And through a discussion of the basic challenges and pains of cell sharing, we kind of better understand what is so difficult about serving a prison sentence, because a lot of it can be found in a shared cell to a heightened degree. The very different outcomes of mutual hostility and fear versus kindness can both be seen as the outcome of enforced intimacy in a very small locked space. And the micromobilities in the cell that we discussed here highlight deprivation of dignity and privacy and the intricate complexities of cell sharing. We also saw what McDermott and King described as despairing or desperate attempts by people who felt dehumanized and powerless to maintain some conception of themselves as active controlling agents in some small sphere of their life. And this small sphere, according to our interviewees, is often their shared cell. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. And Ben, I guess, as well. So we can move to some of the questions now, and I would encourage everybody to submit your questions through Teams, please, so that we can present them to the paper authors. So the first question is from Christophe, and he's asking, can we assume that the principles of cohabitation in a cell are quite similar to the principles of cohabitation in the broader context of the prison?
Well, in some ways, I guess, yes, but I think everything in the cell happens to a much more heightened degree. So I think the relationships that you have with your cellmate are or can be quite particular in that I guess they're much more intense or can be. You might have relationships with prison staff or with other prisoners on your wing, for example, that are maybe less tainted by this really close encounter of having to share all of those kind of dignity issues, I guess, and privacy issues that that don't come up when you have a kind of relationship with staff in the same way. It might be similar in that you still find similar kind of horizontal elements to the relationship that you have with other prisoners, but to a much more heightened degree, I would say.
Thank you. So you made some really interesting observations in your paper about the ways in which control over time and space have to be kind of negotiated in between people who are sharing cells, and you use this nice term, the dance, the kind of the moving around in space. How can you tell us a bit more about how the prison authorities enable, or perhaps don't, that dance to take place?
Yeah, I guess it's very different depending on which prison you're in, and also I guess it depends on who's working at the time, because I think prison staff react quite differently to different prisoners, depending on how they see them, if they see them as kind of easygoing or if they see them as a problem. But also, I guess it depends as well on which cellmate you have. So I think this dance really depends on that you kind of click with this other person, that you can kind of find a way to move around each other and find a way to interact meaningfully, as opposed to the people who we saw using solo strategies as opposed to joint strategies, who were not able to do that with their cellmate, and who might have been prevented from engaging with their cellmate in a more positive way by the decisions that were made kind of above from staff of who is sharing a cell. So I think they have very much, it's kind of, it might not interact directly with the prisoner-prisoner relationship in the cell, but of course staff, especially on the wing, who make the decision who will share a cell, have enormous impact on how these, how this kind of dance might evolve or might not happen.
Thank you. Just picking up on that issue about how the dance evolves and perhaps how it might change over time, I wondered if you could comment, and this is a question from Holly, about whether there's any evidence of these patterns changing over time, and perhaps this is something, I don't know, in relation to the length of sentences or the length of time for which two people might be sharing a cell, so how those how their use of time and space might change through that time.
Yes, so I think it very much depends what situation you're in. So if you are sharing a cell with someone and then with the next person the next day, it's not really possible to engage in a kind of joint strategies as much. Maybe just the kind of very basic ones of kind of letting people into how understanding how the prison works, that kind of thing, but not so much having a kind of joint strategy in how to use or how to give each other privacy. So I think if people are sharing for longer periods of time, this very much evolves, and I think we've seen how people kind of develop friendships and that last a very long time, sometimes even beyond people's prison sentences. So we could see in one quote how someone said that their previous cellmate is going to come up to visit them and has written them thank you notes. So I think some people's relationships kind of develop and evolve over time, whereas that very much depends on how long you share a cell for and what kind of impact you make on that person.
Thank you. So there's a series of questions which all kind of pertain to methodology and context of the work. So I'll present them all to you and see if you can perhaps, I'm assuming that some of the answers might be fairly short. So firstly, a question from Carolina Sanchez-Bow, who's asking about the images which you presented in the talk. So asking if you took them and if you can tell us a bit about perhaps the ethics perhaps of taking those pictures and how you collaborated with the people whose cells they were. So perhaps we'll take that one first.
Yes, of course. Very happy to talk about that, and it kind of links back to the exhibition that you can all look at as well, because quite a few of the pictures you can see in the exhibition. Yes, so we used kind of photographs as one fieldwork method and one part of the methodology, and I think it's really it kind of helped us to especially come to this kind of to use this comparative element in both countries. Obviously the pictures you can see here are all just from England and Wales, but it was very much a kind of collaborative effort. So the pictures you can see were only taken with people's consent, obviously, and some people actively asked us to take pictures of their cell, and we're quite proud to show them off. I think in one picture you can actually see a person lying there. He was even though you can't really identify him, but he was also very happy. He wanted us to kind of take a picture of this scene of what everyday life in the cell kind of looks like. So I think it's always tricky to find the right balance in the field of how you negotiate confidentiality and how you take pictures. Obviously, taking a camera into the prison is quite complicated, and you are kind of asked a lot of questions, but in some ways that really helped us, because it helped us engage with people, it helped us get people interested in the project, and it kind of helped us to in the aftermath of the fieldwork to kind of visit those places again, and it really invokes their kind of nature, and I think it's quite fascinating to use photographic evidence alongside interviews. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Anna. So we'll take the last two questions now, which are both, as I said, connected to kind of the how and where of this research. So there's a question for which the person hasn't given their name, but they're asking about the spatial context in which this research happened. So we've obviously heard a lot about the double bang-up cells, but have you conducted these kind of, have you been asking these kind of questions in more kind of dormitory spaces, for example, which there might be in Cat D for prisons, comparing these two cells? And then a question from Ettore Asoni, who's asking about whether your interviews were with prisoners in segregation or in the general population, and whether you can comment on the difference that this dance kind of might make, or how the dance might happen when you have cellmates who are locked up for almost all of the day, which of course has been the case, at least in the UK over the last few months. So what difference it might make in these spaces depending on how many hours per day are being spent in that shared space.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks. Yeah, so I would say that in terms of the overall project, we have interviewed people in lots of different spaces in the prison, so ranging from, and also lots of different prison categories, so ranging from open prisons to high security prisons. And we have interviewed people who were sharing cells, who were in segregation, people who were in kind of, I guess, I'm not really sure we've come across people who were in dormitory cells as such. I think there might have been very few, one or two people in Norway actually, who were in cells that were housing more than 2 prisoners. But it's very rare actually to come across that. So most people were either in shared cells just with one other person, or in single cells. So dormitory cells don't really happen unless I think maybe there's a severe overcrowding possibly. But yes, so in terms of kind of where we did the interviews, for this particular presentation, all of the data that we've used is with people who were in shared cells, which means that they were not in segregation at that particular point in time. They might have experienced segregation beforehand or maybe afterwards. And actually some people used it as an active strategy to move themselves to segregation in order not to have to share their cell with a person that they couldn't get on with. But obviously most of the interview material that I've referred to here is very much part of the people on kind of normal wings, as you would say, kind of everyday locations.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So I think we've reached the end of the time slot for this first session.